In the suffocating heat of Arabia, pushing past 45 degrees Celsius, you find yourself standing atop the massive stone walls of Muscat. All around you is pitch-black darkness, and the only sound is the water of the sea lapping against the foot of the fortress. But that silence is what makes your skin crawl. Your comrade who stood watch yesterday was found this morning hanging from the battlements, his tongue cut out, his eyes blinded. His mouth was stuffed with sand, and the words, "This is your final warning," were carved into his chest with a blade. You grip your musket tight and offer a prayer, but you shudder at the cold chill creeping up your spine. This is the vivid terror of the 17th century, where the Portuguese, invincible, Armada, the masters of the world's oceans, were being slaughtered by the warriors of the Yaruba Dynasty, the small giants of Arabia. Today we unearth a record of blood that history tried to erase, but could never fully vanish. This is the story of how the predators of the Age of Discovery were turned into prey, a brutal and magnificent victory by Omani warriors, who dyed the blue waters of the Indian Ocean crimson with the blood of their enemies. What bizarre and cruel methods did they use to drive out the monsters of Europe? And why did the victorious Sultan display the corpses of his enemies in a manner too gruesome to behold? We invite you now into the very heart of that hellish battlefield. The story begins in the port of Muscat, Oman, which had groaned under 150 years of Portuguese oppression. The Portuguese lived in luxury within their impregnable fortresses, Al-Jalali and Al-Mirani. Looking down on the world, they treated the natives worse than beasts, cutting off the ears and noses of those who couldn't pay taxes and scattering them in the streets. But in 1624, with the rise of Nasir bin Murshid, the founder of the Yaruba Dynasty, the very air began to change. He gathered the scattered tribes with a single goal: "I will wash this sea clean with the blood of the Portuguese." Nasir knew a direct assault was impossible. The Portuguese cannons would turn anything approaching the walls into dust. So he chose a tactic that tested the very limits of human endurance: silent slaughter. For months, Omani warriors trained in total silence, learning to move like ghosts along the cliffs near the forts. They coated their bodies in black oil so that not even moonlight would reflect off their skin, and they carried curved Khanjar daggers gripped between their teeth. On a stormy night, a Portuguese sentry lowered his head for a moment to shield himself from the lashing rain. In that split second, a faint swish was masked by the storm, and a rough hand clamped over the soldier's mouth from the shadows. There was no time to resist. The razor-sharp dagger pierced the softest part of his neck between the vertebrae, and his life poured onto the floor with the rainwater before he could utter a single scream. The Yaruba warriors stripped the fallen man, donned his uniform, and seeped deeper into the fortress. When a Portuguese officer woke the next morning and opened his door, he was greeted by the meticulously severed heads of his lieutenants. Inside the fort, there was no screaming, only a silence heavier than death. This was the first psychological castration the Yaruba Dynasty performed on the world's strongest military. Now we reveal the specific rankings of blood that drove the Portuguese to ruin. As we descend, the cruelty and precision of these tactics surpass all imagination. Number 7, the Hell of Thirst, the Curse of the Rotten Wells. The greatest weakness of the Portuguese fortresses was their water supply. The Yaruba warriors located the underground conduits leading into the forts. Instead of simply cutting the water off, they devised a more sadistic plan. They hacked hundreds of rotting animal carcasses into pieces and stuffed them into the channels. Within days, the Portuguese soldiers were drinking liquid rot without knowing it. The effect was immediate. Dysentery and cholera tore through the ranks, soldiers twisted in agony, purging blood and waste. As the entire fortress turned into a massive morgue, the Yaruba warriors stood atop the outer walls, singing songs as they listened to the screams within. For the soldiers who crawled out of the gates begging for life, there was no water, only the cold steel of a blade across their throats. Number 6, the human hook of the high seas. In naval combat, the Portuguese galleons were as tall as castle walls. Yaruba warriors approached these giants in small, agile boats. They threw ropes tipped with sharpened, triple-pronged hooks onto the decks. But these hooks weren't for securing the ships. They were designed to snag the shoulders, thighs, or even the faces of the soldiers aiming their muskets above. Soldiers were yanked off the decks, screaming as they fell dozens of meters. Before they even hit the water, Omani javelins were hurled at them in midair. The sea was quickly covered in fragments of human flesh and shattered armor. Watching the sharks swarm below to tear apart those who fell, other soldiers on deck were so gripped by terror that they threw themselves overboard to escape the inevitable. Number 5, the sentence of fire, the suicide fire ships. To annihilate the Portuguese fleet, the Yaruba dynasty packed their old, worn-out ships with gunpowder, pitch, and oil. They set these vessels adrift with the wind, pushing them directly into the center of the Portuguese formation. When the Portuguese fired their cannons and hit these boats, they only triggered massive explosions that spread the flames to their own ships. The smell of burning flesh drifted across the ocean as soldiers were roasted alive on deck. Armor, heated to a glow, fused to their skin. Those who dived into the sea to escape the hellish heat were dragged to their watery graves by the weight of their iron gear. Records from the time state the sea, burned with fire and blood, acting as the substitute for God's judgment. Number 4, the ghost butchers of the sandstorm. In land battles, the Yaruba warriors used the harsh Arabian nature as a weapon. When the shamal, a violent sandstorm, blew in, the sophisticated Portuguese muskets jammed with sand, and the soldiers couldn't even open their eyes. In that moment, the warriors of Oman appeared like wraiths through the dust. Crawling low with shields in one hand and khanjars in the other, they sliced through the Achilles tendons of the soldiers. As the men collapsed, the warriors would shatter their spines from behind and vanish back into the storm. The Portuguese felt they were fighting invisible demons. If you were there, hearing the sudden, short-lived screams of your comrades all around, could you have kept your sanity? Number 3, a head more precious than gold. As the tide of war turned, the Portuguese crown and Spanish kings sent ships filled with massive amounts of gold to ransom their captured high-ranking officers. But Sultan bin Saif mocked the gold. He threw the bars into the sea in front of the fortress. Then he filled the gold chests with the salted, severed heads of the captured Portuguese officers and sent them back to Lisbon. When the royal court opened the chests, they were struck with a horror that paralyzed the nation. A rumor began to spread in Portugal. A post in Oman is a death sentence. This gruesome delivery of heads branded the madness of the Arabian warriors into the mind of all Europe. Number 2, the whaling of Mombasa, 33 months of carnage. This was the siege of Fort Jesus in East Africa. The Yaruba army surrounded the fort for nearly 3 years. Deprived of supplies, the Portuguese inside resorted to eating rats, then leather shoes, and finally bundles of documents. Famine and plague killed 90% of the inhabitants. When the Omani warriors finally breached the walls, they didn't find living humans but walking skeletons. Yet the warriors showed no mercy. Fueled by 3 years of built-up rage, they executed every single survivor, creating a pool of blood on the fortress floor. The fort's sewers poured red blood into the sea for days. Number 1, the prey becomes the hunter, the great Indian Ocean counter-strike. The Yaruba dynasty didn't stop at driving the Portuguese out. They dismantled and studied the captured Portuguese warships, building a massive fleet of their own. Now, the roles were reversed. The Omani fleet began striking directly at Portuguese strongholds in India, like Goa and Diu. The European giants, who had mastered the seas for a century, would now abandon their ports and flee at the mere sight of an Omani sail. This reversal, where the pride of the West was trampled under the blades of the Yaruba, was the most magnificent twist in the history of the Age of Discovery. This story isn't just a record of an old war. It tells a cold truth. No matter how much power or capital a strong man possesses, they cannot defeat those who harbor a mad venom to protect their land and pride. The Yaruba dynasty carved the pride of Arabia into world history, with blood by beheading the Portuguese and casting them into the Indian Ocean. Even now, on the old fortress walls of Muscat, the scars of those blades remain vivid. They say at night you can hear the souls of the thousands of Portuguese soldiers wailing. But perhaps that sound is actually the majestic roar of the Yaruba warriors, holding their blades high in celebration of victory. How did you find this record of a brutal and fiery victory? Isn't it surprising that such a massive counterattack existed behind the glamorous history of Western expansion? If this story was chillingly interesting, or if you felt the thrill of this great historical reversal, please hit the subscribe and like buttons. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for watching.